Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today, I think we'll have a relatively short lesson, day 53, right? We're reviewing verb conjugations, and yesterday we looked at all the verb types, of which there are quite a few, that are formed, conjugated using the "ul" endings. Today we're looking at the "e" endings. And again, this is one of these things, since conjugating Russian verbs can seem so daunting at first, it's helpful, I think, to try to get clear as best we can about certain issues. And the first one is which verb types take the e endings. There are only three of them, right? So if you remember that, it's fairly simple. Only three verb types take e endings. The most important group by far is easy to remember: e verbs, right? We call these e verbs. They take e endings. The other two types that can be a little trickier are what we call yeah verbs, yeah verbs. And finally, a third type that we're not looking at today, actually, I don't think we've had a single verb belonging to that type. We will later. We call them ja verbs, ja verbs. So anyway, if you look back at the master table, you'll see somewhere near the top, there's a little subheading there that says we have three verb types taking the e endings. And those are, again, e, yeah, ja. So you can look that over. And then if you look at all the other types, you'll see they all take yeah, your endings. Right. So again, it's common for students to to make things almost overly difficult and start putting e endings all over the place on all different verb types. Right. So I think if you remember that the e endings are really actually quite limited, that's very helpful, right? Because then everything else we just remember, okay, there's going to be your endings, right? Unless it's an e, yeah, or ja verb. Okay, so let's look at the major type here, e verbs, right? As we know, there are tons of e verbs in Russian. Again, quick review. The most common verb types in Russian are probably I verbs, first of all, then probably e verbs, and then I would say a close third, although I don't really know the statistics specifically, but ova verbs. Right? Those are the really common types. Okay, so let's look at e verbs like ответить. Okay, these e verbs take e endings, and if you remember, they mutate in the ya form only if a mutation is possible. Okay, so remember that little formula. That's really important. And again, this is really important to know, not just casually, but to really master, because there are so many e verbs. So this is something you really can't avoid at all in Russian. Okay, so let's look at our head verb here, ответить. Okay, it's an e verb. We can tell that, and by the way, these are also relatively easy to spot, provided that the infinitive is more than one syllable, right? You may remember some of these tricks we discussed back in book one, right? Anyway, so a verb like Pete may look like an e verb, but because it's only one syllable, ignoring any prefixes, by the way, it's actually not an e verb. It's a soft sign verb, as we learned yesterday, right? Pete, to drink. But ответить, we have a prefix actually, от, but even if we ignore that, we're left with vietit, right? More than one syllable. And so we can safely guess that this is an e verb. Okay, now the question is, will there be a mutation? Well, there will be in the ya form only if a mutation is possible. So we look at our final stem consonant, which is a te here. We ask ourselves, can te mutate? Yes. And when it does, it mutates to ch, right? So yes, a mutation is possible. So yes, we're going to have one here in this ya form only. So we get отвечу, отвечу. But then in the remaining forms, we're back to te, right? No mutation anywhere else in these e verb forms. So we get отвечу, ответишь, ответит, ответим, ответите, ответит. And for this particular imperative, that would be ответь, right? Because of the stress in the ya form. Okay, so let's look at a few examples. Спросить. Okay, can that mutate? Yeah, right. S can mutate. So we want to say, why don't I ask the waiter where the bathroom is? Давайте я спрошу. Okay, so there's our ya form. That's where we're going to get the mutation if one is possible. Here one is possible, so we have a mutation. Давайте я спрошу официанта, где здесь туалет. Okay, again, if the pattern would be спрошу, спросишь, спросит, right? Everywhere else, we don't have a mutation. Okay, the same verb we saw already, ответить, to answer. You can ask her, but she will not answer, right? Ты можешь ее спросить, но она не ответит. Она не ответит. Okay, and we know hopefully that ответить from the pair отвечать, ответить, that's perfective. So when we conjugate this verb, it ends up being future tense. Number 3, говорить. Now they are talking, or now they are saying that they don't understand in what the deal is, right? Meaning they don't understand what's going on. They don't understand what the deal is. There are lots of ways to translate that idiom in Russian. Okay, теперь они говорят, что не понимают, в чем дело. Они говорят. Они говорят. That's an in-stressed noun, and so it's taking, right, the ya endings. Now, by the way, in terms of review, that third plural ending is where people often make a mistake. They'll say things like говорют, right? They'll add that a yut or ut form in the third plural. Remember that for the e endings, we get e, and then yat, right? So we're trying to write yat unless there's some spelling rule, like the 8-letter spelling rule issue that makes us write at instead. Okay, number 4, reflexive verb учиться. Где вы учитесь, right? Shifting stress back onto the syllable, the stem, back onto the stem, right? Где вы учитесь? Я учусь в МГУ, right? Meaning at Moscow State University. Okay, here's a thing you might want to circle, right? Yeah verbs like сидеть, сидеть act exactly like e verbs. This also confuses students, right? Remember, if these are taking e endings, then what happens essentially is that the yeah vanishes, right? The yeah, that little stem vowel in the infinitive, just disappears, and we don't get сижу, сидишь, сидят, or something. That's the typical mistake, right? People want to keep that e there that's in the infinitive. No, we're adding the e endings, right? I should have said to keep the yeah in the infinitive, right? No, instead we're getting rid of the yeah. We're writing e everywhere, e endings. Я сижу, ты сидишь, он сидит, мы сидим, вы сидите, они сидят. The imperative would be сиди. Okay, so e endings on this yeah verb. So essentially in the present tense, or in these conjugated forms, right? Remember, they could be future tense. It depends on the aspect of the verb. These verbs look exactly like e verbs, right? Because the yeah is nowhere to be found anymore. Now, of course, in the past tense, you would see a difference because you're working from the infinitive, and you would get the past tense, for example, сидел, сидел. Okay, let's say I usually sit on the sofa while the cat sits on the floor. Я обычно сижу на диване, а кошка сидит на полу. Number 2, cats, note the plural, right? We're going to start seeing plural nouns here in this chapter finally. Cats see very well even at night when it's dark. Кошки очень хорошо видят. Они очень хорошо видят даже ночью, когда темно. Number 3, увидеть, there's the perfective, right, to catch sight of, or simply to see. Tomorrow you'll see what kind of surprise I have for you. Завтра ты увидишь, какой у меня для тебя сюрприз. Number 4, ненавидеть. I hate this movie, I will not watch it. Я ненавижу этот фильм, не буду его смотреть. Okay, let's kind of break down these e and yeah verbs, right? So we've just taken a look at the patterns, but these are a bit tricky. So we can break them down a little more carefully into sort of subgroups based on whether or not a mutation can occur, basically. Right, so the first possibility, of course, is that final stem consonant, whatever it is, can mutate, and so it does mutate in the ya form only. So we could break down a few more examples, right? Ответить, отвечу, ответишь, платить, плачу, платишь, that's a shifting stress verb. Просить, прощу, просишь, shifting stress. Спросить, спрощу, спросишь, right? So again, you're seeing the mutation in the ya form only. Okay, so let's just run through a few of these. Встретить. Okay, now all of these, by the way, just because they're in this exercise, it means that yes, they can all mutate. So we're going to mutate them in the ya form only. So встретить, you might want to pause the video and try to run through the pattern before I give it to you. Встретить, встречу, встретишь, встретит, встретим, встретите, встретит. Ты. Okay, now the imperatives, right? Let's try them. Why not? Встреть, right? Because the ya form is встречу, and вы встретите. You don't hear that imperative too often, but that's what it would be. Okay, the next one, видеть. Я вижу, видишь. Remember, we're writing E here, not yeah, right? Russian E, because these are E endings. Он видит, видим, видите, видит, right? And for that, there is no modern Russian imperative of видеть. There's an old one, видеть, which is short Slavonic, but Russians don't use that anymore. Instead, they say смотри, right? Look, right? Anyway, ходить, our good old friend there, the indeterminate verb of motion. Я хожу, ты ходишь, ходит, ходим, ходите, ходит. The imperatives will be ходи, ходите. Лететь, the determinate verb of motion for being underway by air. Я лечу, ты летишь, right? An in-stressed verb. Он летит, летим, летите, летят. Ты лети, вы летите for the imperatives. Пригласить. Я приглашу, ты пригласишь, он пригласит, мы пригласим, вы пригласите, они пригласят. The imperatives would be ты пригласи, вы пригласите. Finally, чистить. Okay, that's stem stress already. We can tell that by looking at the infinitive. And we're going to get here that cluster mutation, right? Este will mutate together to become sh. And we don't see those every day. But again, that would happen whenever we have a final este in the stem. Я чищу, ты чистишь, чистит, чистим, чистите, чистит. And ты чисти, and вы чистите. Anyway, those are two imperative forms. This one is a bit tricky because the este, you may remember that sometimes you can add an unstressed E to an imperative form if it ends in a cluster, right? So instead of adding a soft sign, you may sometimes hear an unstressed E as your imperative ending. I think most Russians would, to my ear, maybe I'm wrong, they would say чисть, right? Чисть, чистьте, right? But again, because with that form, we end up with the cluster at the end. Чисти and чистите is also possible. Okay, anyway, ездить. Я езжу. Okay, there, the Z typically is not pronounced, but the only thing mutating here is the final D, right? D mutates to zh, and so we're writing езжу, and we're saying usually езжу. Я езжу, ты ездишь, ездит, ездим, ездите, ездит. And the imperatives would be езди and ездите. Right there again, the unstressed E because of the cluster, the Z cluster at the end. Okay, to pay. Заплатить, я заплачу, ты заплатишь, right, shifting stress. Заплатит, заплатим, заплатите, заплатит. And the imperatives would be заплать and заплатьте, заплатьте. Okay, the subgroup number 2, right? A labial mutation can occur, right? So a mutation can occur, but one of a rather different type, right? A labial consonant, so any sound you make with your lips, that's a labial, like b, p, v, right? That's going to mutate by adding a soft L, right? So that's a little bit different. So let's review these four. Любить, люблю, right? There's the mutated form. Люблю, любишь, любит, любим, любите, любит, люби. Купить, куплю, купишь, купит, купим, купите, купит. Готовить, готовлю, готовишь, готовит, готовим, готовите, готовит. Yeah, try to speed it up, by the way, as you're doing this at home, right? You can do it very quickly, right? And the more you practice, the faster you can go. Nравится, here's an example with a reflexive particle. Nравлюсь, nravishься, nravится, nravimся, nravitесь, nravится. And the imperative would be nravся. It would be very unusual, but that's what it would be. Okay, so let's do a few of these labial mutations. Приготовить. Я приготовлю. Ты приготовишь, приготовит, приготовим, приготовить, приготовит. And imperatives would be приготовь, приготовьте. Познакомить, right, to acquaint someone with someone else. Я познакомлю, ты познакомишь, познакомит, познакомим, познакомите, познакомит. Imperative would be познакомь, познакомьте. Okay, now of course could add a particle or reflexive particle to that to get a new verb meaning to get acquainted, right? Which is a little bit more common, I think. Right? Познакомить means to acquaint someone else, to make them acquainted. Познакомиться means to be made acquainted, or we would say in everyday English, to get acquainted. Полюбить, полюблю, полюбишь, полюбит, полюбим, полюбите, полюбят. And that would be полюби, полюбите. Оставить, оставлю, оставишь, оставит, оставим, оставите, оставят. Оставь would be the imperative. Вы оставьте. Okay, subgroup number 3, just because of the verb, or because it happens to have a stem ending in er or che or n, for example, no mutation is possible, and so we don't get a mutation anywhere, including in the ya form. Right? Now note that we will typically preserve the softness of the consonant unless some spelling rule intervenes to tell us we can't write, for example, a U. So let's look at these examples. Говорить, to speak. Говорю. Okay, so no, we do keep the softness, right? We write U, but we don't have any further mutation. The er can't mutate to anything. Говоришь, говорит, говорим, говорите, говорят, говори. Okay, учить, учу. Okay, there we write u basically because of the spelling rule, right? That's the way we could talk about that very easily. The 8-letter spelling rule tells us we can't write u or ya after any of those 8 letters, right? The 4 hushings, the 3 velars, g, ka, ch, or the odd man out, sa. Okay, so we end up with учу, учишь, учит, учим, учти, учат, учи. Получить, okay, that ch, again, it can't mutate, so we're left with получу, получишь, получит, получим, получите, получит. The imperative would be получи. And помнить, n can't mutate, it can be soft, and so we do here preserve the softness. Помню, помнишь, помнит, помним, помните, помнит. The imperative, because of the cluster, again, we get unstressed e, помни. Pomni, right? That's a little bit of an unusual case there, and I think we've seen already 3 examples of it today. Again, if you want to review the imperative, there is a lot more to say about that. Just go back and do the lesson again. We had a couple of lessons in book 1 where we covered the imperative in detail. Okay, let's see. Let's do a few of these examples with, examples where there's no mutation possible. Позвонить, that'll be позвоню. This is in-stressed. Позвонишь, позвонит, позвоним, позвоните, позвонят. Imperative, позвони. Решить. Okay, again, final consonant is sh. That can't mutate, so it doesn't. Я решу. Okay, and there, again, we're writing u because of we could say simply the 8-letter spelling rule. We can't write u after a sh, so we write u. Я решу, ты решишь, решит, решим, решите, решат. And there again in that third plural, right, we're writing reshat, at, right, not yat, basically because of the 8-letter spelling rule. Подарить, shifting stress to give as a gift. Я подарю, ты подаришь, подарит, подарим, подарите, подарит. And the imperative right following подарю would be подари, подари. Закончить, stem stress. Я закончу, ты закончишь, закончит, закончим, закончите, закончит. Okay, there again, because of the ch, the 8-letter spelling rule tells us we can't write u or yat after that letter. So we end up with я закончу, u, and они закончат, закончат, at. Okay, that leaves us. We've now done an overview of all the major verb types that we've seen so far. Remember, there aren't really a whole lot out there left to study. Now that leaves us with what are the irregular verbs that can't really be grouped into a verb type? Well, there they are on page 13, right? There are the major ones that I think we've seen already. And here I've given these to you in the pairs, right? So note that for a few of these, only one member of the pair is irregular, right? But again, because these can be so confusing, in part because they involve an irregular verb, it's really great to learn them as pairs. So, for example, хотеть, захотеть, есть, съесть, брать, взять. Okay, there the брать is actually an NSA verb, as we reviewed yesterday, but взять is pretty weird, right? Возьму, возьмешь, right? It's got that weird stem that you can't get from the infinitive. Now look at the verb to give, давать. The imperfective is an avai verb. That's a regular verb, right? It's the perfective that's irregular, right? And you can imagine how common that verb is. And that's an example of an aspectual pair that a lot of students don't really learn very well, right? And it's a really important one. So, for example, if you want to say, I'll give you that tomorrow, you need to say yadam, yadam, right? Perfective, giving the one-time future tense meaning, right? Dayu means I am giving, right? Or I give. Okay, finally, one verb here, one pair is not irregular, right? Much, smuch. I've included it here because it's weird, and we've only, I think, seen this one example of a g obstruent. We will see more later, but for now, this verb really is almost irregular. And by the way, a lot of books would treat it as such, right? So for now, let's just throw this in with these truly irregular verbs, but keep in mind that this is actually not irregular at all, right? So more on that later. Okay, so for these, just try to run through the pattern. And again, there's really no way out of it. You just have to drill it until you've mastered the pattern. I'll run through these. And again, you can pause if you like and practice reciting the forms. Хотеть. Хочу, хочешь, хочет, хотим, хотите, хотят. Past tense, again, we should note that even the past tense of most irregular verbs is regular, right? The past tense is regular in the sense that we get it straight from the infinitive, right? So again, once we're talking about past tense, things get even easier in Russian. There are very few irregularities. Хотел, хотела, хотела, хотели. Захотеть is going to work exactly the same way as хотеть. We're simply adding the prefix za. Захочу, захочешь, захочет, захотим, захотите, захотят. Okay, what about есть, right? To eat. Ем, ешь, ест. Едим, едите, едят. Съесть, right? There again, we're just simply adding a prefix to get our perfective, so it works the same way as the imperfective. Съем, съешь, съесть. Сидим, сидите, сидят. Брать, NSA verb, беру, берешь, берет, берем, берете, берут. Past tense, брал, брала, брала, брали. There's that feminine ending getting the stress, which often happens with monosyllabic verbs in the past tense. So again, брать is actually not irregular, but its perfective, взять, is, right? So if you want to say, I will take something, you say that all the time, even in restaurants, right? I'll take this, I'll take that. When you're ordering, я возьму, I will take. Возьмешь, you will take. Возьмет, возьмем, возьмете, возьмут. Возьми, right? Here, take this. Взял, взяла, взяла, взяли. Again, there's that feminine ending taking the stress in the past tense. Давать, a regular avai verb. Даю, даешь, дает, даем, даете, дают. Давай is the imperative. And again, in the past tense, we typically go straight from the infinitive. It doesn't matter what crazy things are going on in the conjugated forms. So that usually doesn't. So that means we get daval, davala, davala, etc. Dats, dam, right? I will give. Dash, you will give. Dast, dadim, dadite, dadut. Die is the imperative. Past tense, dal, dala, dala, dali. Okay, finally, again, this regular g obstruent, moch. Now we see the ge popping up in the first singular and third plural forms, right? So we see that there's this ge lurking, and then in the so-called inner forms, right, the four middle forms in this table, the ge actually mutates, right? So that's actually quite weird, and you can see there are two verb types, I think they're at the very bottom of the list, ge obstruents and ka obstruents, that follow this somewhat unusual pattern. But again, they are systematic in the sense that there are multiple verbs in these types, and they all follow this pattern. So we say, yes, this is not irregular, this is a regular verb, even though it's somewhat unusual. Могу, можешь, может, можем, можете, могут. Past tense is weird for these verbs, right? Мог, могла, могло, могли. Okay, so for those obstruents at the very bottom of the list, the very bottom of the master table, usually something weird is going on in their past tense, right? We can't get it straight from the infinitive. Smoch, students often ask, when would you use this perfective? Well, if you're talking about a one-time ability to do something, like tomorrow I'm not going to be able to, or yeah, tomorrow I'll be able to do this or that, you would say smagu, smagu, right? I will be able, right? So you don't hear that constantly, but it's you would use it just the way you would use any other perfective form. The form would be, again, now here we're simply adding sa, the prefix sa, to the forms we just recited. Smagu, smojish, smojit, smojim, smojitye, smogut. Past tense, smog, like he wasn't able to do it. He failed. He tried to lift the rock, but he couldn't. He was unable, right? In a one-time way that's emphasizing, right, lack of success. Smog, smagla, smaglo, smagli. Okay, let's try a few of these, right? And again, you might want to circle this in the book. This is something that, I'm sorry, if you want to learn Russian, you really need to master all these verbs here. They're very common. They're tricky because they do involve irregularities. So you don't have much choice but to just learn these, right? There's not really a good shortcut to learning them. Okay, but just keep in mind that apart from these, there really aren't a whole lot of other irregular verbs lurking in Russian, especially not any that you're likely to see or hear in everyday conversation. So again, whenever we get to something difficult like that that's very limited in scope, it's really useful just to take a deep breath and say, okay, this is really weird, but this is not something I'm going to be seeing constantly in Russian. Okay, let's say she wants to go to the movies and I want to go to the theater. Where are you all going? Where are they going? Okay, you see, we're just trying to practice. Она хочет пойти в кино, а я хочу в театр. Куда вы хотите? Right, where do you guys want to go? Куда они хотят? Right, where do they want to go? What are you guys eating for dinner? We usually eat, or what do you eat for dinner? We usually eat borscht. I usually eat cake for dessert. Okay, что вы едите на ужин? We usually eat, мы обычно едим борщ. I usually eat, right, я обычно ем торт на десерт. Number 3, okay, dać. Okay, now when we conjugate this is going to be future tense and meaning, right? It's a perfective verb. So literally, if you will give me money, I will buy you a ticket to the theater, and I will give it to you tomorrow. Если ты дашь мне деньги, я куплю тебе билет в театр и дам его тебе завтра. Okay, remember with если clauses, we use future tense in Russian talking about a future example, right? So literally, if you will give me money, not if you give me money, the way we say in English. Right? If you will give me money, I will buy you a ticket and I will give it to you tomorrow. Okay, much. I want to relax. I want to take a break, but I'm not able. Right? Я хочу отдохнуть, но не могу. They also are unable. Они тоже не могут. We're simply not able to take a break. Мы просто не можем. Мы не можем. Okay, last thing today. Irregularities in the past tense. Now remember, again, this is one of these things in Russian. It makes life so much easier. We've seen how crazy these conjugated forms can be. We've seen all these different verb types and how sometimes we can't know the type from looking at the infinitive. We can't know the stem from looking at the infinitive. And there's all this stuff to learn that we've reviewed here just in the past couple of days. But remember that past tense in Russian almost always is formed straight from the infinitive. So again, the tendency among students, they've learned that Russian is extremely difficult and that they want to make everything difficult. But remember, some things in Russian are really, really easy. And the past tense is one of those things in Russian where you don't have to learn a whole different set of forms that are crazy and have to be memorized in some way. You can go almost always straight from the infinitive. Okay, so we're here at the bottom of 13. We're going to just look quickly at those very few instances where that's not the case, right? And just remember that this is very unusual. Okay, so first thing is we could have some truly irregular past tense forms, meaning something totally crazy that we can't get from the infinitive, or really we couldn't possibly guess it from anything. We've already seen the most important ones, I think, those of et, right? So the past tense there is shol, shla, shlo, shli. Similarly for paiti, we get pashol, pashla, pashlo, pashli. You can see that there's no way on earth we could have guessed that. If you're wondering, those actually, the forms from shol, right? That's actually a mutated form of the root chod that we see in the verb chadit. Okay, so historically that root having to do with motion by foot, right, became something more like shedl, shed, shedl, shedla, something to that effect. In time, the dead dropped out. And so basically this form is now pretty much unrecognizable as even being related to et, right? Okay, so that's just a crazy verb. Okay, so those are just truly irregular past tense forms. We have to simply learn those. Okay, now other past tense forms may look irregular. They're actually not, and we'll be more comfortable with that later as we see more examples in a given type. But again, the obstruent types at the very bottom of the master table in the back of the book, those also do not form their past tense from the infinitive, right? So for example, moch, right? Well, first of all, that's a weird looking infinitive, by the way, as is et, right? So you could actually kind of just look at that infinitive and guess that something weird is going to go on with the infinitive, because there's no soft T to simply drop and then add an L, right, the way we normally would. Okay, so the past tense for moch is mok, magla, maglo, magli. Okay, so that's very typical. We'll see more examples later where the masculine form ends simply in the stem consonant with no L. The L is dropped off. It's vanished historically, but the L is retained in front of those other endings. Okay, so just take an early look. Hopefully you know that by now, these past tense forms of moch, that's going to be very typical for these obstruent verb types. Number 3, we mentioned yesterday, the so-called disappearing nu verb type. There are a fair number of verbs like this. We haven't seen very many so far, but a common example is привыкнуть. So the past tense is not привыкнул, because for a disappearing nu verb, the nu drops out and we end up with привык, no L, привыкла, the L reappearing, привыкла, привыкли. Okay, finally, there are a few non-syllabic stems like /er, right? Non-syllabic verbs that are also a bit tricky in the past tense. I think we've seen one of these. If not, we will later when we start reading Russian literature and people are dying left and right, the way it always seems to happen. Anyway, be that as it may, the past tense forms of umirets are umir, umirla, umirla, umirli. So again, you see we have this kind of weird thing where the masculine past tense form ends in the final stem consonant without the L. Elsewhere, the L reappears, and you get kind of a funny pattern. Okay, so sort of like with morg, just try to learn that pattern, and we're going to see things very similar to it happening with other, for example, non-syllabic verbs. Okay, the final little tricky thing that can happen is that even if the forms are spelled normally, that is, if the past tense is formed regularly, right? We take the infinitive, we drop the soft T, right? That is the infinitive ending. We add L for our masculine, then we add A or E for the other forms. So for some verbs, even if those are formed regularly, we have something irregular going on in terms of the stress. Namely, as we've seen, the that feminine ending is stressed, but the other endings are not. That's something to watch out for. It's not entirely predictable, but it's fairly common among verbs whose infinitives are monosyllabic if we ignore any prefixes. Right, so take for example, zyats. Okay, only one syllable there. So we could guess maybe that it's going to be, and indeed it is here, взял, взяла, взяла, взяли, right? Where the the feminine form is stressed on that but the other forms are not stressed on the ending. Now, the only trick with that is that's not entirely predictable. Again, if the infinitive is only one syllable, we can often reasonably guess that that would be the case. But by the way, look up back at the page 13, back at the verb есть, right? That's only one syllable, but it's yell, yella, yella, yeli, right? And so it's a common mistake to maybe want to say yella, ana yella, she was eating, because again, it kind of looks like it could be one of these uh, uh, verbs with the stress pattern in the past where the is stressed, but it's not. Okay, so again, as with so many things in Russian, it's hard to give a rule for that, but that is a fairly reliable and reasonably common pattern in the past tense. Now remember that for the vast majority of verbs, they're going to be more than two syllables right in there. They're going to have more than two syllables in their infinitive, more than one, or even more than two. So for example, a verb like делать, you would almost never see that stress in the past tense. It would be делал, делала, делала, делали, right? Okay, so that does it for today. That does it for our review at this point. For the most part, actually, we've reviewed conjugation. Now, on day 54, we're going to start introducing, we're going to have a rather soft introduction to some new grammar. And we're also going to review just a couple of other topics related to verbs as we introduce some health-related vocabulary. We're going to be talking about health and the body in this chapter. So we'll learn how to name body parts and things like this, which often come in pairs, right? And so that'll give us a good chance to practice learning, finally, the nominative plural. Okay, so anyway, until then, до свидания, товарищи, вперед к новым победам.